It's the last day of the month, which means it's the last installment of Dragon Ball Dissection December. I hope you enjoyed the movie last week because now we're back to Dragon Ball GT. Due to how far ahead of schedule I need to be, this is the first episode I've written since Dragon Ball Dissection December went out to the public. As such, it's the first time I get to address feedback. Now, I know some of you have been wondering, where's the fashion? Why haven't I talked about the music, the opening and ending sequences, all of that stuff? Well, I figured we'd have plenty of time for that at some point. Given how much there is to establish at the beginning, I wanted to make some forward progress. I mean, sure, I could have done a fashion extravaganza while all the classic characters were assembled, but did you really want me to spend 2 videos on episode 2? We'll see them again, and for a longer period of time, so I figure it can wait. All that said, I love a good topic episode, and there does seem to be a particular topic on everybody's minds. How much time has passed between Dragon Ball GT and the previous series? Is it 5 years or 10 years? Oh, we are diving deep today. I stated in part 1 that, officially speaking, Dragon Ball GT takes place 5 years after the end of the previous storyline, despite the fact that many people seem to think the time gap is 10 years. I mused over where the idea first originated, since I knew it dated back to at least the late 90s. Everyone, and I mean everyone, made sure to tell me. That originated from the dub. Oh, that's from the dub. The dub started that. It was Funimation's dub that made it 10 years. No, I get it. At the time, I was really trying to skim past that as quickly as possible so I could cover episode 1's plot in detail. I was hoping I'd successfully defused that situation by specifying a time frame that predated Funimation's 2003 GT dub. But I have to concede that in the year of our useless Dende 2022, I'm sure there are a lot of people unlike me, happy people whose job it isn't to meticulously catalog these inane factoids in their brains, who don't know that Dragon Ball GT wasn't dubbed in the US until 2003. So you know what? I'll concede that I tripped and fell into this ditch all on my own. And hey, the good news for me at least is that you all seem to finally believe me when I say I don't watch or follow the dubs and might not be familiar with stuff they make up. I've never seen the dub of Dragon Ball GT, or at least I hadn't, until now, because you guys inspired me to get to the bottom of this crap. If this many people were convinced that that was the truth, I knew I had to at least try to set the record straight. Let's set out the basics here. As far as I've seen, there is nowhere in the original Dragon Ball GT itself that explicitly states when it takes place in relation to prior Dragon Ball events. No character says it, no narration says it. While there are many contextual clues, there are no diegetic elements that definitively date the series. So, how is this a debate at all? Where does any of this nonsense come from? I've stated before that the idea of the age calendar in Dragon Ball can be traced to Trunks reading the display on Cell's time machine during that storyline. There are also a few references within the arc to real-world calendar months and dates, as well as that weird thing. Based on references such as those, the 7th Daizenshuu extrapolated enough to create an official timeline for all of Dragon Ball's major events. It's through this we know, for example, that Goku was born in age 737, and that the fight with Frieza takes place on December 24th. That timeline establishes that Dragon Ball begins in age 749 and ends in age 784. This is for the manga. The animated version would be similar, but certain elements like the 22nd Budokai and Gohan's time in high school draw things out across many more days. Now, Dragon Ball GT has its equivalent to the Daizenshuu. They're called the Dragon Ball GT Perfect File Volume 1 and Perfect File Volume 2. They were released in May and December of 1997, respectively. The first one was published while Dragon Ball GT was still on the air, the second right after it ended. And it includes its own timeline of events related to that series. It's not as comprehensive as Daizenshuu 7's timeline, but it does repeat several pertinent entries from that book, such as the year of Goku's birth. And it lists Dragon Ball GT's events as taking place in age 789. That's where 5 years comes from. So where does 10 years come from? Well, that's a bit harder to figure out. Everyone says the dub, right? And that makes sense. Funimation's uncanny ability to simply make things up has complicated Dragon Ball discussion for years, so it seems like something they do. Case in point, throughout the past week, I've had countless comments asserting that there is so a GT movie. Actually, I'm working on this before anybody's even seen my last video, so I really have no idea if that actually happened. I'm just playing the odds. So, is 10 years in Funimation's dub? I actually don't know. Despite so many people telling me that it is, I have yet to find an instance of that being spoken within their version of the show. People have helpfully pointed out spots to me where they believe it's said, but I've checked those spots and no, it's not. To be fair, I have not, and don't intend to, watch the whole dub to look for this. I don't plan to ever do that. That's not what the focus of Dragon Ball Dissection is. I've already watched more of it in the past few weeks than I ever wanted to. And before anyone asks, yes, I did track down a copy of the dub-only recap episode Funimation made to cover up the fact that they lost the first 15 episodes until it was deemed financially viable to find them again. They don't say it there either, unless there's a script difference in the Game Boy Advance video version, which is the only one I could find. The closest reference to 10 years I've spotted is an archived version of Funimation's Dragon Ball GT website that patron Kian Hartley sent to me. So while neither version of the show itself explicitly commits to a specific passage of time, maybe, their ancillary materials have taken a stand. Never did I deny that Funimation's dub perpetuated the idea that Dragon Ball GT takes place 10 years later. I'd heard that for years. My only issue was the claim that they started it, which I knew they didn't. But another reason I was so vague in part 1 is because I didn't really have much to go on besides a distant memory. I remembered thinking it was 10 years later when I was watching GT on VHS fan subs years before the dub. I've seen accounts from other people of similar backgrounds who asserted the same belief. But that is pretty weak evidence on its own. So given the avalanche of comments I was getting about this, I decided to put my money where my mouth is. Thankfully, given how many videos I had to make this month, it didn't take me very long to find definitive proof. I thought about where a lot of the online information was coming from in a pre-dub world, where a lot of my formative information came from in those days, and that immediately led me to Curtis Hoffmann. If you've watched enough Dragon Ball Dissection, you're probably familiar with this name. Curtis Hoffmann was a fan who lived in Japan in the 90s, while Dragon Ball was still running. He translated and summarized a lot of Dragon Ball content and posted it online. His manga summaries were my first introduction to most of the series. His work was invaluable at a time when Dragon Ball was barely a glimmer on these shores. I still have my printed out, stapled copies of his summaries that I used to take to school with me to read. They are cherished memories. Because I am a dweeb. So even though I had no memory of coming across anything GT related that Hoffmann did, I thought I'd at least check. Sure enough, he summarized this too. And in his summary of GT Episode 1, dated April 1996, 2 months after the first airing of the episode, Hoffmann writes, "Around 10 years have passed since the end of Dragon Ball Z." So there you have it, a reference to 10 years that predates Funimation's dub by over 7 years. Given Hoffmann's reach back then, it's entirely possible that this is where the idea started. And since the official stance was hidden behind imported guidebooks, it's easy to see this gaining more traction, perhaps to the point that Funimation had gleaned it from the fandom and assumed it was true. Or maybe they came up with it independently, or from earlier foreign dubs, and it just happened to match this idea. After all, the vagueness within the story itself led to many publications of the day providing their own speculations as to when the series took place. You can see that in this compilation made by VegettoEX of the website Kanzenshu. So that solves that. Fans thought it was 10 years all the way back in 1996. The question behind the question, though, is why do people assume 10 years at all? In a way, it almost seems too convenient. Dragon Ball has had many time skips. Aside from the regular recurrence of the Tenkaichi Budokai providing 2 3-year time skips in a row, Toriyama always seemed to vary the intervals to make them seem realistic. 5 years here, 1 year here, 3 years here, 7 years, 10 years. It seems kind of odd to follow up the longest gap the franchise has ever done with the exact same gap right after it. Admittedly, this marks the point where control is no longer in Toriyama's hands. Still, it's odd. VegettoEX pointed me in the direction of a Usenet post he suggested might be a 10 years reference that even predated the Hoffmann summary by a couple of months. The wording is a bit muddied, conflating multiple events in the same sentence, but to me it reads like he's referring to the 10-year gap after the fight with Boo. Regardless, I think it brings up an interesting point, aside from the all-too-real possibility of poor word choices causing unintended misinformation to spread. And that is that I feel people tend to conflate these two time periods. The epilogue of Dragon Ball is such a tiny, dangling thing that's barely around long enough to make an impression. It introduces characters who don't have much of a role until Dragon Ball GT, so I feel like it's easy to mix them together. And so the 10-year gap there becomes a 10-year gap here because fans know there was a gap and this is the same one, right? Maybe. With that, let me jump back to Curtis Hoffmann. Believe it or not, I actually did my due diligence on this. Since this was the oldest definitive reference I've so far found, I wanted to at least try and find out where he got it from. Maybe he was the source. Maybe he would lead me to the source, like a magazine or early promotional reference. I didn't expect him to remember after over a quarter of a century, but why not give it a shot? While doing my research, I found an old email address of his floating around and decided I'd reach out. And to my shock, he responded. Let me just say that 14-year-old me would have flipped, especially since he was more than patient with my stupid questions over a subject I have to imagine he has not cared about in decades. He even went back and watched the first episode to check. While the passage of time is what it is, he actually seemed relatively confident that the assertion in his summary came from a line of dialogue within the episode itself. At one point, Pilaf brags about the decades he spent researching these Ultimate Dragon Balls. As Hoffmann says, it means that more than 5 years passed since the end of DBZ, given how much Pilaf and company have aged, and that they couldn't have started looking for the Ultimate Dragon Balls much before Goku encountered Ubu. I still think that Pilaf's statement shows that at least 10 years has gone by since the end of DBZ. And we can debate how old it's plausible for Pilaf to seem, or how long it's plausible he was researching, but that statement does line up with a lot of the commenters on my videos these past few weeks. It might not be that specific evidence, but the takeaway is the same. There are certain elements in the series that just make it appear more logical that Dragon Ball GT takes place 10 years later instead of 5 years later. I think there's an element in particular that many fans point to. Let's look at Pan. Like I've said, her portrayal could really go either way. Some people argue she's taller than Goku, but Goku's kinda shrimpy. Stylistic changes over the years lead to inconsistencies so that Gohan can be roughly the same size as his father at a third of the age. People grow at different rates, girls tend to mature earlier than boys. Let's not even get into the retcon of how Saiyans mature later that seems to exist to gloss over those inconsistencies. So, no, I personally don't think Pan is a smoking gun. But while Pan is taller than Goku, she does appear to be significantly shorter than Bra. Bra is almost certainly a major reason why people think 10 years is more plausible than 5. For whatever reason, Toriyama's GT design of Bra, and yes, he did design these characters, has her look like she's in her late teens. The way she acts in the show and is treated by others suggests she's a teenager. And she's dressed in a way that would typically be considered a bit risque for a child. Bra definitely looks older than Pan in Dragon Ball GT. I'd argue she looks older than Pan at the end of Dragon Ball, but we see so little of her that it's really hard to tell. So just how old is Bra supposed to be anyway? That's where it gets fun, because that's its own can of worms. Daizenshuu 7 contains profiles for characters, including their birth years. It lists Bra's birth as age 778, a year before Pan, who was born in 779. So there you go, right? That would at least explain why Bra looks older than Pan. She is. As I said at the beginning, though, Daizenshuu 7 also lays out the official Dragon Ball timeline. And in that timeline, Bra's birth is placed in age 780. the year after Pan is born. That date of birth is the one repeated in the GT Perfect File timeline. You know, the one that establishes GT taking place roughly 5 years after the end of Dragon Ball. So isn't that fun? Daizenshuu 7 is inconsistent with itself. You could argue that GT's continuity was going off the assumption of the older age for Bra, but its own guidebook states that Bra is younger than Pan. And of course, it's this age order that is ultimately stuck, as Dragon Ball Super has definitively shown Bra being born after Pan. That still means Bra has to be somewhere between 8 and 11 at the beginning of that series, which is very difficult to square with this design. A 10-year gap would raise her up to between 13 and 16, and that feels much more logical. So, what have we learned from all of this? I honestly don't even know. Why was I doing this again? Oh yeah, it was to prove that Funimation's dub of Dragon Ball GT did not, in and of itself, create the pervasive idea in fandom that GT takes place 10 years later. It's been around much longer. I think I've at least managed to settle that. However, it's wholly understandable why so many other sources, from fans to dubbing companies, have come to other conclusions. The show itself, never stating anything directly, is far more vague than Dragon Ball traditionally is about its passage of time. The guidebooks can contradict each other, or a guidebook can contradict itself. Who knows if the writing staff were aware of them or gave a crap about them? Character designs, especially this one, give what could be considered conflicting perceptions, and GT itself has so far been something of an evolutionary dead end for the franchise, so there's been little need to expand off of anything it's said or done. I'm sticking with 5 years unless some new nugget is unearthed, because that is the only official date provided for the series that I am reviewing. VegettoEX is currently combing through a lot of 1996 magazines, so stay tuned. For right now though, like any good static character, I've learned a lot, but have come away from this experience having changed in no discernible way. How inspiring. Whew, so that was a lot. I don't mean to toot my own horn here, but I'm a little amazed I managed to get involved in this crazy mystery while I was making all these other videos. I certainly hope this was informative and entertaining, despite being different than what even I was expecting the last video to be. Sometimes I just gotta go where the wind takes me, and the wind has definitely been blowing in my ear this month. So that's another Dragon Ball Dissection December in the books. The 10th Dragon Ball Dissection December is in the books. I hope 2022 has been as fun for you as it has been for me. I hope the 29 new videos I made are videos you've enjoyed. Thank you for continuing to give me the opportunity to entertain you. Thanks to all the names flying by on the screen for their financial support. Thanks to the friends on social media and Discord I bounce ideas off of or rant to. Thanks to commenters who inspire videos like these. Thanks to the helpful people who provide information or resources I need for videos. I could go on all day with reasons to thank so many of you. The journey continues, and I hope to see all of you, as well as many more of you, in 2023. Happy New Year!